Hi all, dear friends. Welcome to this new episode of my podcast, A Digital Tomorrow. Today, I'm joined by Ambassador Abed. Welcome.
Thank you for having me, Ariel.
It's actually my pleasure. Well, for those of you who don't know Gabriel yet, Your Excellency Gabriel Abed is currently working as the Ambassador of Barbados to the United Arab Emirates. Aside from that, he also founded Abed Group more than 2 years ago in Barbados. He's member of the GFC Council of the World Economic Forum and the founder of Bitt, a company about which we're going to talk later as well. So once again, Gabriel, welcome to this episode, and I hope you enjoy this discussion.
Looking forward to it.
Well, looking at your fantastic professional biography, which I summarized very briefly a few seconds ago, we can see that you founded Bitt, a financial software company, which is working on the CBDC area. You were appointed last February, almost 1 year ago, as Ambassador of Barbados to the United Arab Emirates. Could you please tell our listeners a bit more about your very interesting personal journey? Like, for example, what made you decide to enter the fintech world a few years ago?
I would say, simply put, alignment of market conditions, opportunities, and technology. I had completed an undergrad in network security, of which cryptography was part of that educational process. And that wrapped up around 2010. And at that time, the Caribbean markets were plagued with a fiasco called de-risking. And I saw an opportunity to apply blockchain technology to the process of central banking and the monetary system as a whole. So around 2013, I co-founded Bitt.com, which had an agenda to, at first, build a digital asset exchange for the Caribbean region. And later, over the course of several months, we realized that there was a grander opportunity at hand, one where there was a deficiency in financial inclusion, in modern payment systems, in digital payment gateways, and in general, how central banks offered financial tools and services to the market. And Bitt pivoted to becoming the first company in the world to pioneer, introduce, and invent central bank digital currencies and bring that to the market. And that was around 2014 and 15.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for sharing. You actually mentioned like all the topics that I want to cover later in our discussion. I want to talk about CBDCs, about the Caribbean, about the United Arab Emirates. So maybe we should start with CBDCs. You mentioned what Bitt did in this area. So the Caribbean is undoubtedly one of the most active regions in the world in the area of CBDCs. It launched, the Bahamas launched the Sand Dollar. Then there is as well this Bcash project launched by the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank. Why is the Caribbean so active in this CBDC area compared to other regions in the world?
There's really two sides of that. The first side is, like many developing regions, there's an absolute need for this type of technology. It serves so much value. The pros significantly outweigh the cons at a monetary authority level, at a government level, at a citizen level. So that's one of the reasons that we see developing nations heading towards this. But another reason is that Bitt really put in the footwork throughout the Caribbean region, starting as early as 2014. Myself and several other members of the Bitt team in the early days flew to several Caribbean nations and met with the monetary authorities there, convincing them at a very early stage, or attempting to convince them at a very early stage, that this technology can make a dramatic difference to their way of life and governance. And of course, as the technology started to take roots and prove its viability, as groups like World Bank, IMF, and other multilateral organizations started to back the technology, it started to become something that the Caribbean nations became a lot more serious about. And I think the real turning point was the fact that Bitt had already launched a synthetic version of its product in Barbados. That was actually the first nation in the Caribbean to come out with a blockchain-based stablecoin. And subsequently, we then saw the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank governor speak about this technology on a live platform. And then Bahamas went down this road as well. But the real turning point was when Facebook announced their DM, I believe it was called back in the day, and China announced their plans for a digital currency as well. And those two key factors were ones that really made this a global topic, and one that gave the assurances to the markets that this is something that they should be doing. So the central banks were already geared up. They were already educated. They had received workshops, educational sessions, several pitches. So it was just a natural progression. And now today, as a result of that, footwork and initial homework, if you will, the Caribbean nations are the ones leading this charge.
Mm-hmm. Indeed, indeed. I know you mentioned this before, at least briefly, but could you please elaborate a bit more on what Bitt exactly did in the area of CBDCs and why Bitt was a pioneer in that area?
So when Bitt first started to focus on this area, which wasn't called Central Bank Digital Currencies, I believe that was a coin term by a gentleman from the Bank of England in 2017. We were calling it central bank dollars, monetary authority currency. We had several different names, but the industry took a holding on central bank digital currencies after 2017. But prior to that, Bitt had built a product, a process, a procedure, an educational platform, and went to each central bank, specifically in the Caribbean region, and tried to push them in this direction. And it was a process of where you obviously started off with your initial pitch, your initial conversation, the educational session, and we're talking over several months. It surely didn't happen overnight, and in some cases, several years. And that process took shape in the form of workshops, in the form of prototyping and demonstrating the potential utility and use cases of the software. And eventually, it started to make the right sense to the various parties at the central banks, to the point where they were willing to contractually engage and take on the subject. And that looked like a situation of where they had to dictate what specific features and desires they wanted, as every central bank's policies and mandate are different. While they do have a blanket set of functionalities, every central bank's desires are different. Their needs or their wants for their citizens, for their economy. One might be more interested in privacy, as opposed to another might be more interested in financial inclusion. Another might be interested in competitiveness in the financial sector. And it was understanding what each central bank's desires were, adjusting the platform to suit, and then making that offering available in accordance with that. And that was a very lengthy process, but one that obviously has paid off since, because as you see today, Bitt.com, of which I'm no longer an active member of the organization, I'm just a happy founder and shareholder, but Bitt.com is the leading company in the world today on the topic of central bank digital currencies. It has active and live products in the market, active and live multiple central banking clients. I believe Bitt is in more than a dozen countries around the world. So it's something that in the early stages was very hard to convince central banks, but like a domino effect, once the first domino dropped, the others started to come on board.
I see. You actually made a reference now to an idea that I always point out when teaching the CBDC courses that I teach at CFT in London and other organizations. And that idea is the fact that each CBDC is different because the policies and interests of central banks are different. And I know this idea may seem basic, but that's something that makes CBDC so unique. I mean, the idea of where each central bank wants to put their focus on, whether they want to focus on financial inclusion, on promoting their currency for cross-border payments. I mean, there are like many purposes behind CBDCs, and each CBDC may be designed very differently.
Absolutely. In my experience visiting and in discussions with the various central banks around the world, I had never had two of the same requests. They've always been different, even in the same trade blocs or regional trade unions. Every single country's monetary authority has different requests, different features, different concerns, different policies, and different issues. And that ultimately results in a very different product every single time. And I think that's what Bitt did really well. Bitt built a digital currency management system that was versatile enough that it can accommodate the various requests of various central banks.
Well, I guess that's what makes this CBDC area so fascinating, at least to me. Following on CBDCs, I wanted to ask you as well about the idea of whether there is for you any CBDC project that you find especially relevant right now, especially now that China is about to launch its digital yuan. So do you think that aside from these projects that are maybe like more mature, is there like any other project that you find for whatever reason especially relevant to the point that we should follow that up?
Yeah, I am aware of a couple of interesting projects that are coming to the market. While I won't mention their name, I am aware of projects that are currently working on providing automated settlement and liquidity between various currency types. And that's usually one of the issues. Like, for example, a Barbados dollar to a Jamaican dollar. How is that convertible without going through the common rail of the US dollar? And the interesting part about central bank digital currencies, at least the ones that are designed using open standards and using proper blockchain technology, is that the ability to utilize the next generational layer of that same exact technology, i.e. blockchain, to provide a smarter way of settlement is very interesting. So if you think of about a global settlement system, we could think Visa, we could think SWIFT, we could think things like ACH, SEPA, payment networks in general. I see a new way of settlement that is protocol driven as opposed to a centralized organization. And I think that's the next generation of where we would see wholesale and retail-based payments take place as it relates to cross-border payments. And I think it's from that avenue that you would see nations that would have otherwise have been left off from the global financial system of settlement finally have a place at the table, because that placement is no longer dictated by a central agency, but rather dictated by that of an open protocol. And to me, that is a much more fair and conducive system to a fairer financial system. And I think that's where we're heading towards right now. And I am aware of several projects working towards that. You even see agencies like Visa incorporating things like CBDC into their network and starting a global settlement network around that technology. But the reality is, I think a superior version of that is one that's holistically driven by a protocol layer. that is decentralized. And that doesn't mean that your AML, KYC, and CTF can't be met. It just means that the dictation of who gets to participate changes dramatically.
Mm-hmm. Now that you mentioned decentralized networks and protocols, I wanted to ask you about privately issued cryptocurrencies, and especially how do you see the future coexistence between CBDCs and cryptocurrencies, especially stablecoins? I know this is a hot topic because some people say that the rationale behind CBDCs may be that of trying to not ban, but at least fight against cryptos. But to me, CBDCs and cryptos may play a different role. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
I don't see it as a fight at all. I think back to this one gentleman on my trip to the United Kingdom in 2016, before the world started to talk about CBDCs. And I mentioned to this chap what I was looking to do with Bitt, in that we were going to issue a central bank driven currency. And this gentleman looked at me and he said, we'll never adopt that in the UK. God bless the Queen. And the reason I bring that up is because you will always have a subset of society that strongly believe in their fiat or local currency from a position of trust. And maybe education or circumstances might change that, but you will never convert 100% of people. And that subset of your economy or of even the global stage, there needs to be an interoperable way that they can operate with that of cryptocurrencies, and vice versa. There are people in the cryptocurrency field that will never want to work with fiat again and would only choose to work with decentralized currencies, from their payments to their funding their way of life to their investments, etc. And the way I see it is it boils down to preference of the consumer, preference of the regulator, preference of the economy. And I see a world of interoperability. And it may be a case of where some systems are more controlled than others, some systems are more open than others. But ultimately, it's less about a fight and more about a system where we are going to see full-on integration and compatibility between all of these various currency types, asset types, and payment mechanisms. I actually see a convergence of not a single world currency, but of tens of thousands of currencies, stablecoins, asset-backed currencies, decentralized cryptocurrencies, central bank digital currencies, all operating within many different networks together. And the user at the end of the day having a preference, or the merchant having a preference on what they want to send, what they want to receive, how they wish to store it. And I see protocols, both decentralized and centralized payment systems coming about that allow the convertibility from one asset type to another, and giving that user the ultimate control over what they're sending, what they're receiving, what they're custodying. And that to me is a system that is fair, inclusive, open, accessible, and dictated by the end user. And that's the kind of financial system that we should be living in. One where if I want to store Bitcoin, but you want US dollars, I should be able to send you my Bitcoin and you should be able to receive US dollars. Change those two asset types to any asset type, whether it's gold-backed currencies, uranium-backed currencies, SDRs, it really doesn't matter. At the end of the day, I see these systems driving towards further interoperability, liquidity, and convertibility. And I don't see this as a war against one asset type or another. I see this as a blanketing of the financial system so that we all have a choice. And I definitely know from a position of a factual context that central bank digital currencies were not created to be a replacement or to be a utility for central banks to fight against cryptocurrencies. And I'm speaking as the inventor of central bank digital currencies, that when we came out with this system, it was because God bless the Queen. I don't want to use Bitcoin. I want to use my trusted fiat currency. And I realized there needed to be a bridge between the new world and the old world. And we had to create that. And it was from a position of needing to build that interoperable environment where fiat cash, I couldn't plug it into my phone. PayPal or a Visa system was not accepting a digital protocol rail. And therefore it needed to be invented so that it was a direct convertibility system or protocol or bridge or environment that allowed me to move from that asset type A to asset type B. And there was nothing in the mindset of us as founders or creators or pioneers of this subject that said, I want to give the central banks a tool to fight Bitcoin. It was actually the opposite. I wanted to give the central bank a tool to allow Bitcoin to thrive. And I didn't see it as a war. Maybe today, some persons at some multilateral organization may have that view, or maybe some Bitcoin maximalists may have that view, but it's certainly not the case. You need to ensure that ultimately all players within the financial system have a choice of using whatever asset type they regulate or whatever asset type the user wishes to embark on, and ensure that there's a way to move between them.
I mean, I fully agree with you. You know it, of course, much better than I do because, as you said, you invented CBDCs, but I think that to me, it's not a fight either. To me, it's not like that at all. But as you said, some agencies, some people tend to think of this as a fight between CBDCs and cryptos. Not everyone, of course, but some people do. So that's why I wanted to ask you to elaborate on that idea. But your points are actually, well, the same that I would have made. No, I mean, I fully agree with you. I don't think it's a fight between both at all. I think CBDCs, cryptos, they all are part of this future of money idea, that the way we are going to deal with money and use money in the future, whether it is a fiat currency issued by a central bank or privately issued cryptocurrencies, all of them are going to be, well, part of our wallet, and they're going to be interoperable in the end. So that's why I fully agree with your remarks, but I thought, as I said, it was important to discuss it, because especially on the media, there is this constant reference to this fight. But I guess the fight story is always better, for the media than the one about cooperation. I mean, we see the same, for example, when we talk about fintech firms and incumbents. Certain people, certain media tend to all the time try to confront the one with the other and say that fintechs may make banks disappear, when it's not like that. So I guess it's the same idea in this case.
Look, don't get me wrong, we might see circumstances where some jurisdictions use the technology to circumvent the ability for a user to participate in another asset class. We can use China as an example, where they are positioning their central bank currency to be the leading, and if not only, mechanism for payments in the country. It doesn't mean that another nation is necessarily going to follow that process. It surely doesn't mean that the entire globe is going to follow the process. So there will always be the edge cases of where a person, entity, or group utilize a system for their own purposes and policies. And it shouldn't be that because one did it, this is what everyone will do.
Mm-hmm. No, of course. I mean, it's going to depend on each country. As you said, China, for example, is adopting a tough stance towards cryptocurrencies, whilst promoting enormously their own CBDC, the digital yuan. But when it comes to the way they promote blockchain, they are very active when it comes to promoting blockchain as a technology. They created, for example, the BSN blockchain-based service network, whose founder Ifan He was actually one of my guests a few weeks ago on this podcast. So of course, I mean, we are now generalizing, but certain countries may adopt a different approach. But in general, I mean, the idea is that in general, CBDCs do not imply a fight against cryptos, but of course, certain jurisdictions may decide to adopt a different approach based on their choices.
Yes.
And well, now that we already discussed CBDCs, I wanted to ask you some general questions about the two places with which I guess you are more related, the Caribbean and the United Arab Emirates. The United Arab Emirates is undoubtedly a hub for digital innovation. In the past few years, financial authorities in Dubai and Abu Dhabi have been motivated to create a regulation that could foster the UAE's status in the crypto scene. And then they also created some CBDC projects like Project Avar. So could you please tell our listeners a bit more about the United Arab Emirates' approach to blockchain in general and to cryptos in particular?
I think the United Arab Emirates has done a stellar job of how they've managed the landscape of cryptocurrencies. I mean, even up to, I think last month, new regulations came out around criminal conduct around this area, which is quite interesting because now they actually have clear mandates for how to deal with particular persons that embark on fraudulent or nefarious activities. And if I'm not mistaken, ADGM, one of the leading regulators in Abu Dhabi, has already put out a framework towards this type of technology. And then you see free zones around the UAE, such as DMCC, DWTC, DIFC, all coming out with their own variations of how they perceive various types of blockchain technology and cryptocurrency-based innovation. And what's interesting is because you have these various free zones, which are quasi-regulatory environments in their own right, pioneering the way that they handle this technology, you actually have within one country several options should you be an innovator or a pioneer in this subject. And that has resulted in some of the leading companies like Binance and several others, Casper Labs, making their way to these shores, to the point where on the ground in the United Arab Emirates, you're seeing so many blockchain-enabled entrepreneurs, companies, staff members, and ideas floating around. And it should not be said that the UAE regulators are doing this and the government's doing this free will. They're absolutely coming at this from an educated perspective. They're taking their time to understand the market. They're making sure that they don't allow the technology to run ahead of the protection, the regulation, and the mechanisms that they need to put in place to protect the consumers and the country, because they're absolutely doing that. So what we are seeing in the UAE is a great balance of innovation and regulation, which is creating a market that's conducive for a builder of this technology to have a level of legal clarity when entering these markets. And that yields a much greater populace around the subject. And that's a summary of what we've seen in the UAE. They've done it better than most parts of the world. They have the infrastructure to support it. They have the right type of market environment to encourage the growth of the technology. The lifestyle here is absolutely incredible. So it really does boil down to the UAE probably is the most idealistic hotspot in the world right now for this technology.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a good summary. Thank you for sharing. And now back to the Caribbean. If I'm not mistaken, Barbados became the first country in the whole world to open an embassy in the Metaverse, in the Central Bank. So could you please share with our listeners how this will work exactly? Like, what does it mean for Barbados to become the first country in the world to to formally recognize the digital sovereign land?
So I think it's pretty important to note that there were several other countries in the past, like the Maldives and I believe Estonia and Sweden, that had launched a virtual embassy in Second Life as early as 2007. What Barbados did that was different is it used decentralized technologies, such as Decentraland. And the reason that it utilized these technologies is because you no longer have a situation where a central company like Linden Labs, who owns Second Life, can dictate what happens on your virtual property. And instead, you have a consensus-driven environment made up of the majority, which is far more democratic, far more secure, and a lot more, it positions Barbados in a way where we have sovereign control over that plot of land as long as we control the cryptographic keys. The reason that Barbados embarked on such a project is because we are a small nation, a relatively small nation in the grand scheme of the global stage. We're also one with limited resources. And if we look at our diplomatic relationships around the world, Barbados only boasts just shy of 20 missions around the world. And while we are friends of all nations, we unfortunately cannot have a presence across the globe in every single nation. But when you start to change the thought process from that of having a physical presence to that of having a virtual presence, it starts to eliminate the resource limited factor to the point where a small nation like Barbados, who may have several plots of land in decentralized environments, could invite another nation to establish on Barbados's virtual plot of land, and vice versa, Barbados can establish on their virtual plot of land. And just from that simple concept of it being a virtual establishment of a bilateral, call it a meta treaty, you're able to reduce the requirements of the resources that are needed to not just build, not just maintain, but to staff, to house. And that allows a nation like Barbados to start preparing itself for diplomatic parity. And that diplomatic parity means that we could have a presence, a diplomatic presence across the globe with every single nation, the same way many larger nations do. And that single concept allows us to bolster and strengthen the allyship we have around the world. Now, I think it would be prudent to state that a metaverse embassy is never going to replace a physical embassy. There's certain services and rights and protections that a physical embassy is given that a virtual embassy just realistically could never service. And I think it's also prudent to state that a website could do many of the virtual services that a virtual embassy or metaverse embassy can do. I can apply for a visa through a website the same way I can on a metaverse embassy. But the reality is that what's different here is the ability to control and dictate what happens on that virtual plot of land, who can participate on it, who can access it, and who can build on it. And that thought process and idea changes the way that we conduct diplomacy around the world. And now, an ambassador sitting in Barbados could represent 13 nations at once and could be available 24/7 to any of these nations should they need to conduct critical or crucial discussions around the field of diplomacy. I would also state that nothing beats a face-to-face. So in some cases, you will always need to be there in physical presence. So we're not advocating for replacing physical embassies. We're not advocating to replace face-to-face meetings. We're not advocating to be a better version of a website. What we're advocating for is diplomatic parity, to be on par with larger nations so that Barbados has a fair chance of representing its diplomatic will globally. And that's the summary of it.
I like this idea of diplomatic parity very much. I think it's very interesting to see what you're trying to do to achieve through that in order to reduce the barriers that a small country like Barbados may have. As you said, I mean, it's not about suppressing the idea of what an actual physical embassy can do, or it's not about that, but this idea of trying to reduce the barriers that you have when compared to a bigger country. I think this may be very important, not just for you, for Barbados, but in general for any small country.
And I think it's very clear that our Minister of Foreign Affairs and the government of Barbados, in our policy of being friends of all, any nation can come to us and we will help them establish. We will give them our processes, our procedures, our know-how that various developers require to build out their environment. So in a way, it's a version of soft diplomacy in of itself. It's a form of cultural diplomacy. I might trade my virtual art with your virtual art. Maybe we have Barbadian NFT artists and we want to display our NFT art in your virtual embassy, and vice versa, you want to do the same with us. It's a way of trading culture, arts, and craft. And then it goes beyond that to one of technological diplomacy, where we can start sharing technologies. Maybe my e-visa process is so seamless that you want to borrow it and utilize it in your environment. And vice versa, maybe your digital ID system is so seamless that we want to integrate it into our environment because it works. So these are ways of which we can start a new type of discussion based around the oldest arena in the world called diplomacy. So it really changes the way things, and look, we're in 2022 facing a pandemic that is restricting our movements.
Sure.
How do I conduct my job as an ambassador when I'm in a lockdown? And then furthering that, global climate change, which is a crisis facing many oceanfront states like Barbados. How am I meant to get on an airline which is contributing to climate change and participate in that environment when we are going to be greatly affected by this subject? And then furthering that, we are in 2022. We're meant to be utilizing these technologies to make a more efficient way of life. So pick and choose whichever flavor of issue you wish to choose from. This goes beyond diplomatic parity. This goes towards the future of where communication and immersive experiences need to go. Right now, we're not conducting this interview physically. We're over Zoom, virtually. 10 years ago, maybe 20 years ago, this wouldn't have been possible. So we have to think about the future, and look, there is a chance that this could be a big failure. But we as a small nation must try new ways of doing things to prepare ourselves for the future. Should we not try new things, we're only going to result in us being left behind, increasing the amount of issues and problems we face as a nation. And the reality is we'd be shooting ourselves in the foot.
I fully agree with you. Actually, I think that what you just said about being in 2022 and everything else is a good summary of why I created this podcast, which, as you know, it's called A Digital Tomorrow. So the idea is to try to, well, to look in the future, to try to look at what we can do differently. And it's what you said now. I mean, 5 years ago, or perhaps 10 or 15, we wouldn't have been having this podcast like via Zoom. quite likely we wouldn't have had this call, or we would have maybe met in person with all the costs and hassles that this may imply in certain cases. So I think that we need to look in the future. And as you said, especially for a small country, it's important to try at least. You don't know whether everything that you tried will succeed in the end, but at least you trying that is actually great and a great proof that you're actually thinking of tomorrow, which is what I'm trying to do in my podcast as well.
Yeah, and the reality is the Metaverse Embassy is just a starting point of where we're thinking as a government of where we can go. What we're seeing that we could provide for the digital economy, for our way of life and others. What are the next steps after we set up this lookout post? What else can we do once the first entry point is our embassy? What other functionalities, features, and products can we deliver to the global market? I'll leave that to the users and listeners' imagination, but we do have plans. And what I can say is the Metaverse Embassy is the more boring part of the plans. Although it's grand, it's beautiful, and it should change the way that we do business around the world, there are some very cool things cooking at the moment.
Well, I'm looking forward to hearing and reading more about your plans in the future when they become public. And this puts an end to our discussion. We are running out of time, but I must say, Ambassador Abed, that it's been a pleasure for me to have this discussion with you. I got to learn a lot about CBDCs from someone like you who, as you said, invented CBDCs, so it's perfect to talk about this topic. I got to learn a lot as well about what your country, Barbados, is doing, and also about your approach to new technologies in general, which is an approach with which I fully agree, as I said. So once again, thank you very much for your time today. I know you have a very busy schedule, so that's why I appreciate very much your time and efforts to be here today.
You're welcome. Always happy to share, and it's been a pleasure to be on your podcast. I look forward to a digital tomorrow.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador, and to all my listeners, thank you as well for listening to this episode, and please stay tuned for the next episodes. Thank you. Bye. See you soon.
Take care.